you will. We're going to start our Bible study this evening out of the book of Zechariah, chapter number 5. Once again, this Old Testament, and it's towards the end of the Old Testament. In fact, chronologically, it's towards the end of the Old Testament as well. Zechariah is preaching during a time period where he has a couple contemporaries. Anybody know the contemporaries who's preaching or who's writing others? What other books are happening at the same time as Zechariah? Anybody know? Ezra, good. Any others? Nehemiah, Haggai. All right, good. You guys nailed them. Good job. Now, if I had to have a buddy, like I'm going to choose which one, like, all right, this is the guy we're going to go have a board game night with, it wouldn't be Haggai, all right? Haggai is brutal. He's just like straight to the point and just, here, this is the way it is. You don't want to play Monopoly with him. Zechariah, on the other hand, what he gives, which I don't think this is much personality thing, but what he gives is incredibly encouraging as you go through it. But man, chapter 4 is heavy stuff. I mean, it's heavy. We've been going through the visions, and there's a lot of information that I think we'll find in this. The Bible describes in the book of Proverbs that wisdom is like a deep well, and the idea of like it's not just something that when you get it, it's just instantly gratifying. When we look at scriptures, there's the deep well aspect. You got to work for it. In other words, when you're going to get water out of that deep well, what do? You don't just dip it in. No, you have to drop the bucket in, and you're going to lower it down for a while, and then you're going to raise it up for a while until you get it. And this is what I feel like Zechariah is for me. I'm looking at this, and I read it, and we're going to read it through in just a moment. But I read it, and I'm thinking, what? I mean, there's a lot of information there I just simply do not understand. And so studying this has been very, very helpful. I encourage you, while not generally a principle that as far as application goes, if you disagree with me on certain things, I'd love to have the conversations with you about it. Maybe there's in my study, we don't do this in a council setting where we're going to try to go verse by verse and figure out what we all agree on, all right, and then this is what we present. I study it, and I look forward, and I pray about it, but there are still some things that I feel are very very obvious, and there's some things I'm thinking, well, I think possibly. And for instance, in verse number 9, there's going to be a reference about the two women and whether or not, we'll get to that. I see everybody looking at it. That's good. You guys are good students. But in verse number 9, are these women, are they angels? Or are these two women angels? I don't think that they are. And but yet, like almost everybody I know says they're angels, and so maybe I'm wrong. All right. So, but anyways, let's look at verse number 5. Ultimately, the message is still incredibly clear. Powerful, convicting, also looking forward to the future, scary for a lot of people that we know. And so, anyways, look at verse number 1, if you will. Then I turned and lifted up mine eyes. Now remember, he said several visions. In chapter number 4, he was tired even. And so he's like, I got another vision. He's like, what? What's his next vision? All right, so it wasn't quite that bad, but he describes it as one that was woken up. In other words, right in the middle of a really good dream, he wakes up and gets another vision. And in verse number 5 chapter 5, then I turned and lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a flying roll. So here comes another vision. Now this is kind of an unusual vision. All right, it's a flying roll. Now it's not like a bread roll, like Lambert's Cafe, the home of the throat rolls. It's not that kind of bread roll, or that roll at all. Look at verse number 2. And he said unto me, what seest thou? So there's a flying roll. Angel says, what do you see? And I answered, I see a flying roll. The length thereof is 20 cubits, and the breadth thereof 10 cubits. What that means is it's about 30 by 15 feet, and so it's a pretty good size. All right, that's pretty large, right? You got to think wall to wall right here. This is 35 feet, and so just think about that. Just to put it in perspective here, it's bigger than the stage as far as a little bit bigger than the stage. And so this is what we have here, a roll that size. And what we mean by roll, once again, is not a bread roll, but this would be a scroll. This would be a book, but specifically in scroll form. In other words, it's rolled up. In the New Testament, it might even reference it as a book, but it's still talking about the same thing. And so this is a scroll that's been rolled up, or a book that's been rolled up. And so he sees it, and it's really big, and he says, well, what I see is a big roll, and it's about 30 by 15 feet, and which is an unusual number because there's other other measurements in the scriptures that are given. This actually matches one other measurement in the scripture, which we'll go to later. But look at verse number 3. Then said he unto me, this is the curse that goeth forth over the face of the whole earth. For everyone that stealeth shall be cut off as on this side according to it, and everyone that sweareth shall be cut off as on this side, that side according to it. I will bring it forth, saith the Lord of hosts, and it shall enter into the house of the thief, and into the house of him that sweareth falsely by my name, and it shall remain in the midst of his house, and shall consume it with the timber thereof and the stones thereof. Now, if you're like me, you read this and you're like, great. All right, so there's a big old flying roll going to roll around. It's going to go into some bad people's houses, and it's going to burn up those houses. And they can't escape it is the idea. Now, you could probably gather a few things on it. For instance, at a glance, you might catch a few things, kind of like the roll being the law of God. The book of Exodus describes it kind of in a similar way. Now, it's written in tablets, but it's another thing that's written out that's on both the front and the back. Right, so it's on both sides is what it describes in the book of Exodus, and so maybe you can catch that. The idea of this being a curse, and so the law of God being as far as judgment for those that would offend it, and then, of course, that judgment would come by the law that's given. And so there's some things that would come kind of at a glance, at least as far as where I'm reading it. But it's still an unusual vision, regardless, because it's still this flying roll, and that's not unusual. That's not a usual thing that we see. But anyways, what we're talking about tonight is sin. All right, now that's one of those things that we oftentimes try to avoid. I don't believe it's necessary. I don't try. It's not my goal to be a preacher that's hard on sin. Why? Because as you read the Bible, it's hard on sin. It's just the way it is. I don't have to look for things. I don't go to Sunday and be like, all right, what sin am I going to preach against? Hannah, she's always the one that's right here. There's her sins, and again, I pick on her because she's right here. But anyways, what are hers? I don't do that. We just go through the Bibles. Here's the next sin, and I don't have to go look for sins. That's not what's because God just brings them out there, and we can be as hard as God is, and God is very, very diligent about making sure those things are pure. Why? Because He's purifying. He's doing that work, and when I purify things, I tend to not spend so much time cleaning the things that are clean. I clean things that are not clean, and so God is purifying, and he'll hammer out the details and all the pieces that are present, and so He's going to get that right. But the point is going to be a specific message on sin itself. Now, there's two capacities of that. One is the sinner that's a believer, a person that's a believer. We have to understand something. God doesn't like sin. God hates sin. God abhors sin. God despises sin. But we have to remember that's also true for the unbeliever. But the result is going to be different. Now, ultimately, chapter 5 is going to be about the unbelievers. And we're going to see about that. And what he's talking about is how is he going to address it. So really, it's a doctrine of sin as far as how God's view of this is going to be like. We have to understand something, a couple statements here. One is that God is holy. Amen. God is holy. God does not tolerate sin. There's not a part of God that says it's okay. Sometimes we feel like that we just kind of get used to it. There's certain things in my house that I just got used to, marks that are just there. For instance, my wife, we had some paints that were given to us, and so I put some samples on the wall. And so there was a green and a blue and an off-white that ended up being like really yellow. And so we just put samples on this wall in our kitchen, and that was back in August, I believe. Maybe July. And so I put those on there, and my living room is off-white, kind of like a antique white. It's kind of like a yellowy color. My wife kind of likes a color, but a lighter version of that. And so anyways, what I did is I painted the hallway, and where those spots were, I painted them white. And so you can see like this mark about this big that I painted white. Beyond that, there was a bunch of holes like everywhere, and so I patched those holes everywhere in the house. There's not a single hole there, except for there's patches, and there's literally white drywall patches like everywhere in the house. And I did that a while ago. In fact, I told you all about that a long time ago, and I still haven't painted it. They're still right there. And so anyways, those are marks. So definitely the walls are not perfect, not that they ever were perfect, but they're definitely marks that are very noticeable, and I just kind of got used to it. It's like, all right, well, I'll get to it eventually. There's other more important things like I don't want to do it. And so that's why we haven't done it yet. So we just kind of get used to it. But here's the reality is that when it comes to sin, oftentimes here's what happens. We know it's bad, and it bothers us for a little while, but eventually we kind of get used to it. It's just there. And it's so prevalent, it's so everywhere that it was kind of like, well, this is just the way it is, and we don't even notice it anymore. I've heard pastors talk about living in cities, for instance, New York or Las Vegas or San Francisco, where there's sin everywhere. This is abounding all over the place. And you see these things, you're thinking, that would never be okay in my neighborhood. And it's everywhere. You realize something. This is the way it is. And I talk to these pastors, like, how in the world do you deal with this? You just kind of get used to it. And it's really sad when we as Christians allow those marks to be present in our lives, realizing something. God hates sin. He doesn't tolerate it. Looking at a few of those thoughts, look at Psalm 5, verse 4. I'll read that for you. It says, "For thou art not a God that hath pleasure in wickedness." There's nothing about God that makes him happy, or there's any pleasure when he sees any sort of wickedness. "Neither shall evil dwell with thee. The foolish shall not stand in thy sight. Thou hatest all workers of iniquity." The idea is there's an action involved in the wickedness that takes place. God's not okay with it at all. He doesn't accept it. Psalm 11, verse 5. He says, "The wicked and him that loveth violence his soul hateth. Upon the wicked he shall rain snares, fire, and brimstone, and horrible tempest. This shall be the portion of their cup." The idea, once again, of action that will take place. In other words, he's not passive about it. There will be an action that will be performed on it, on the wicked and wickedness that's performed. But at the same time, we understand God hates it, and there's probably nobody in this room that questions that, except for there's the same questions that people like David had. David sees the same thing. In fact, David wrote Psalm 5. David wrote Psalm 11. And he knows God hates sin, but then he asks a question that maybe you've asked. In fact, I'd imagine that just about every believer has asked this. "Why standest thou afar off, O Lord? Why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble? The wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined. For the wicked boasteth of his heart's desire, and blessed the covetous, whom the Lord abhorreth." In Psalm 73, Asaph says, "For I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." You see the wicked prosper. "For there are no bands in their death, but their strength is firm. They are not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other men." Jeremiah says the same thing. That preacher says, "Righteous art thou, O Lord, when I plead with thee. Yet let me talk with thee of thy judgments. Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they happy that deal very treacherously?" I don't remember who it was. We were talking, I think, on the way to golf outing this past Saturday. We were talking about the Marlboro man, or the Camel guy. I don't know what the guy that was known for Camel. Cigarettes. All those, they were cool. Like people want to be the Marlboro man. They want like, it was cool to have a pack of Camels in your sleeve, and you see a Budweiser commercial, and everybody's having fun. It's the funnest thing in the whole world, or whatever other alcohols are out there. That's what they pursue, and it's so much fun. And we talk about the wicked and the misery, and then we're like, but they do look like they're having fun. Well, but their lives are probably a wreck, but their homes are nice, and their jobs are doing well, and they're getting the bonuses, and things just seem to be going together. And Jeremiah says, "God, I know that you're righteous, and I know your judgments are right, but can I talk to you for a moment? I don't understand how it's working. I don't understand why this is working, because they're prospering even though they're wicked. I know you hate sin. You despise it, but at the same time, what's going on here?" And what he's addressing here is the same thing that we would address. It doesn't seem to make sense that all these things seem to be going very well for everybody else that's wicked. And so the question then is, what's going to happen? Why isn't it happening? The reality is that while it may seem that wickedness and sin is winning, and it seems that way, it does. You turn on the news right now, and it just seems that wickedness is winning. There was a point where it was oftentimes considered, and I don't think this is the case, but where the Republican Party was like, "Oh, well, that's the Christian party." And by the way, I don't ever believe the Republican Party has ever had a point in history where they were the Christian party. But the reality is, do you realize that much of the wickedness that takes place, and morality and stuff like that, is happening within the Republican Party? And we're like, well, that's our moral leaders. People like Matt Gaetz, who are big pro-Trump guys, they're involved in immorality and just throwing it out there about how immoral they are and how much they sleep around and how wicked they are, but they're for conservative ideals. Listen, it's wicked. It's wicked, and there's no safety in this, and it seems like wickedness is just the way it is. It's just the way things are. ultimately, the problem is that the victory is in the moment, and we're not seeing what God has in the future for them. In Psalm verse 50, it says, our God shall come and shall not keep silence. What's he saying? Our God may be silent, but he's not going to keep silence. A fire shall devour before him, and it shall be very tempestuous round about him. One of the scariest things that my mom would ever do when I got in trouble, when she found I got in trouble, was when she was quiet. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if I did something and she was instantly mad, I know it was bad. But if I did something really bad and my mom was quiet, then I knew I was really in trouble. The idea here is that sometimes it seems like the wickedness is going unanswered, and God may be silent for a moment, but what he's saying in Psalm 50 is, our God shall come and shall not keep silent. It's not what's going to happen. Psalm 97, verse 1, the Lord reigneth, let the earth rejoice, let the multitude of the isles be glad thereof. Clouds and darkness are round about him. Righteousness and judgments are the habitation of his throne. A fire goeth before him and burneth up his enemies round about. Here's the answer. Jesus is coming back, and he will punish sin. That's the point. Matthew 24 describes the fact that he will judge the nations. The idea on that, of course, is that he is going to establish his reign. He will rule with a rod of iron. There's going to be a great white throne and a final judgment on sin. There's going to be judgments beginning, during, and ending of the reign of Jesus Christ when there's that final judgment. All these things, Jesus Christ knows exactly what he's doing, and it's going to be happening. What's happening in Zechariah chapter 5 is actually fitting into that agenda and explaining how that's going to happen. Now, with this, he's addressing a group of people. In chapter number 4, he addresses the people that have to do this job. We have to preach what was talked about in chapter 3, which was the exchanging of the robes, the exchanging of the garments, that it had to be his robes for mine. I appreciate Matt reminding me of that song and the truth. That's literally what's happening. His robes for mine, the idea of justification, that doctrine I preached on, I don't know, a while ago, chapter number 3. And so anyways, in chapter number 4, the preaching of that truth is by his might and by his power, by his spirit, saith the Lord. And then chapter number 5, not everybody's with that program. So it sounds like, hey, this is going to be great, except for not everybody's going to be with the program. By the way, some of the people that are not with the program are some of the people that are there with them there in Jerusalem, that have traveled back all the way from Babylon and are back there in Jerusalem. And so here's what he's pointing out here. He's saying that of those people, and just remember context, people have left Shinar, they've left Babylon, they've left the Assyrian Empire, or Medo-Persian Empire. They've left there and they've come back to Jerusalem. They're going to build this thing, and they're in a bunch of wickedness. In fact, Haggai preaches about them, talks about them dwelling in their sealed houses, and yet the temple of the Lord is left unbuilt. And they've taken the woods from the mountains, and they've taken that lumber, and they've built their own houses instead of the temple of the Lord. And God's just been abandoned, and they're doing all these things. And all they've done after 16, 17 years, if they've gotten a foundation and they've got the stuff to do the sacrifices, but they've not done what they were supposed to. And what he's saying here is there's a wickedness that is present there. And you might say, well, but we're back. We're here. We're right. And he's saying, not so. Now, yes, there are those that are godly and faithful, but the reality here is that there's a necessity specifically that this wickedness is also something taken care of. And it seems like, well, wickedness is prospering. We haven't finished the temple. It's not done yet. Is this just the way it is? And God's saying, no, I have a future plan on how to take care of this. In the meantime, you need to take care of what you need to. Now, to give explanation to the passage where we've had, I know it's been a long introduction, he describes the vision of the roll as being a 30 by 15 foot scroll with writings on both sides, and it's flying. The idea of flying would seem, and you can disagree with me on this one, but the idea of flying is the manner of visitation. The way it's going to arrive is quick, it's efficient, it's going to get there quickly. But every detail is given there for a reason. First off, I want to mention the measurement. The measurement is identical to one other measurement in the Scriptures, and that is specifically the holy place. Now, to understand the tabernacle, it's kind of larger. In fact, I have a model of it in my office if anybody wants to see it. But you have an outer court. Technically, you have several courts, but you have one outer court for the most part, and then you're going to have the inner court there. And this inner court is going to be made up of two primary things. First off, you have an area that's going to be 30 by 15, and then towards the back of that one, you have an area that is a perfect cube. It's 15 by 15 by 15 as far as feet. And so anyways, the 30 by 15 area is the holy place, and there was expectation. Now, the Holy of Holies is one that only one individual can go in there, representation of the nation before God for his abiding with them. But the holy place was one that required also a holiness about it. The aspect of the prayers that were given up there. There's several things that were done right there in that place that required a holiness in which they would enter in their worship of God. And anyways, it's interesting that this is a standard that would be given there as far as describing the length of that roll, the scroll. But anyways, what he describes in this passage, if you go down to verse number 3, in describing about this roll, it's not just the size of it, but he says that then said he unto me, this is the curse that goeth forth over the face of the whole earth. He describes it in a couple ways. First off, I want you to realize that it's very similar to the way it's given in Ezekiel chapter 2 and verse 9. It says, and when I looked, behold, an hand was sent unto me, and lo, a roll of a book was therein. And he spread it before me, and it was written within and without, and there was written therein lamentations and mourning and woe. The idea of coming judgment that's present. This is what's happening and what's written. In other words, as this is opened up, you're going to find there's a bunch of judgment and mourning and woe, and it's written on the inside and on the outside. So very, very, very similar. You'll find this again in Revelation chapter number 5. I think the most obvious reference there. And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book written within and on the backside. In other words, both sides. Sealed with 7 seals. So this is rolled. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof? And no man in heaven nor in earth, neither under the earth, was able to open the book, neither to look thereon. In fact, the next verse talks about him weeping, just a great weeping, because nobody could open it. The point on that one is John understood something, like the judgments that were been promised, nobody could open it, until finally the one that was qualified, Jesus Christ himself, would open it. Chapter 6 would open up with describing the judgments that would be upon the whole earth, unleashing judgments all over the earth, as Ezekiel would describe it with lamentations, mournings, and woe. And so this is great what's going to take place there. That's only available, only to be opened up by Jesus Christ himself. And so, anyways, it's interesting that the other things that were written from Exodus 32, when the law was given in verse 15, is that it's once again on the front and the back side, on both their sides, what the Bible describes. And so it would seem that the judgment that's given, specifically the curse, is such that it's going to be very terrible, and it's going to be according to, I think based on the size of it, it's allusion to the holy place, or by the standard, the divine standard of heaven, by God himself. It's according to his law, his judgments, and this is something that's set out by him in what's going to happen. It's inescapable. It's flying. It's going in the way he wants. Now, it's going to mention specifically the curses to 2 groups of people. Who are the 2 groups of people? Again, in verse number 3. And I know there's a lot of information. We're only 3 verses in. As far as the 2 groups of people, this is interesting. For everyone that stealeth shall be cut off, as on this side according to it, and everyone that sweareth shall be cut off on that side according to it. Once again, there's 2 sides. And if you open it up, you have 2 groups of people. You have one, everyone that steals. You have another one, everyone that swears. This is one that I'm just going to throw an opinion on out there. All right, so if you have 2 sides, you would assume that this what's given is basically just quantities basically split up in half. The 10 Commandments is given in 2 stones, and of the 5 first ones, the middle one, the 3rd commandment, has to do with swearing, specifically taking the name of the Lord God in vain, which is described as swearing. Oftentimes we say swearing as like a cuss word. The idea of taking God's name in vain embodied much of the Old Testament, the law, the first 5 commandments. Then the next 5 commandments, the middle one's the 8th commandment, has to do with stealing. So the embodiment of all the commandments, if you will. It's possible maybe it's just the 2 commandments specifically, but I believe it has to do with the law altogether, based on how it's given. So anyways, that's my opinion. You're welcome to disagree with that part. All right. So anyways, the point on this is that there is judgment to be given, and it has to do, so a couple things. One, it's based on the law of God, right? Now, this sounds interesting because if you remember back to chapter 3, but wait a second, we're going to get new garments. Everything's going to be great. Everything's taken care of. We have justification. But what about the judgment? Well, the reality here is this is demonstrating that even though there is this, there's still a judgment for those who are still identified by their stealing and by swearing. And specifically, they're swearing falsely by his name. In other words, there's a profession in regards to God, but it's not present. It's not real. And so these would be those that would claim Christianity, that would claim to follow the Lord, and yet it's not a present reality. Not just that they say the name of God in vain, but in their life they demonstrate it. So it's seen in multiple ways, and you find it in different passages of Scripture that describes it that way. But anyways, what he's saying is there is a specific judgment, and according to verse number 4, it's inescapable. It flies to them, it stays with them, and it burns them up. And so once again, it describes it as a fiery judgment according to verse number 4. But then it's going to give something else. Now, this next part will go a little quicker. There's going to be two illustrations that will be giving, two visions. So first one is the judgment of the scrolls. But how is this going to happen? Verse 5. Then the angel that talked with me went forth and said unto me, so envision this, lift up now thine eyes and see what it is that goeth forth. And I said, what is it? And he said, this is an ephah that goeth forth. He said, moreover, this is their resemblance through all the earth. Now, what he's going to explain as far as ephah is, an ephah is a standard of measurement, but the way it's described here is like a container. And so if you could, like a barrel. To us, if you get milk, you normally get it in a gallon container, right? You get those translucent gallons of milk generally. And we understand it's a gallon. Now, those gallons always have milk in it. Well, no, you can get all sorts of stuff. In fact, you can go to the water section, and they have the same gallons. You get water in it. Or you can go like a couple shelves down. You'll have a chocolate milk in it, or a bunch of other stuff. I've seen it over like Menards. We'll have chemicals inside those same gallon containers. The point is it's gallon. Generally, it's perceived as milk jug, but it's understood you can put anything. The idea of an ephah would be similar, where it's generally a grain that would be put in there, but the point is that it's basically a barrel. In fact, it can be described that way. It's 34 liters. It's about 8 gallons. So anyways, it's that size. And anyways, it's usually filled up with stuff. So what he's going to say, though, is that this type of ephah is something that's going to be basically everywhere. In other words, it has, according to verse number 6, there's a resemblance of this basically everywhere throughout this whole world. And so in other words, it's not a unique thing. In other words, there's a lot for it. In verse number 7, and behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead. That's a lot of lead, all right? That's a whole lot of lead. The exact measurement is, I've preached this many times as far as a talent, and it changes all the time every time I look it up, because the truth is we don't know, all right? It's a lot is the idea. It represents more a quantity than it does a specific, it's a lot. That's the whole point, okay? It describes more of an amount of money that's earned during a certain time or a certain portion as opposed to a specific measurement. But anyway, there's a talent of lead. So there's a whole lot of lead. And this is verse 7, behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead. In other words, kind of like a lid. And this is a woman that sitteth in the midst of the ephah. And so you have this barrel, and there's a person inside of it. Now, 8 gallons is not that big of a barrel, but there's somebody inside of it. There's a woman inside of it. And anyways, it's covered up with the talent of lead, verse number 8, and he said, this is wickedness. And so what's the question? What does this woman represent? Wickedness. He tells you this is what it means. It means wickedness. Notice it's not like, what do you think it means? Nothing. This is wickedness, simply what it is. And he cast it into the midst of the ephah, and he cast the weight of lead upon the mouth thereof. In other words, barrel, woman, lid of lead, lid of lead. And so anyway, so that's what you have here. Now, what he explains here is that wickedness gets put into the ephah, so this container, this barrel, and it gets covered up with lead. It doesn't describe what the lead is. It doesn't describe why. It's just that it's shut up in there. Now, to me, I'm imagining this, okay, so why would God have the wickedness put into a barrel and then close it off? Well, that must be judgment. There it is. It's the judgment of God. But it doesn't describe it that way. In fact, look at the verse number 9. It doesn't end with that. Then lifted I up mine eyes and looked, and behold, there came out 2 women, and the wind was in their wings, for they had wings like the wings of a stork. In the book of Leviticus, you'll find out about the storks to be unclean, which is why I don't believe they're angels. They're called out specifically to be an unclean bird. And so anyways, so I don't think it's an angel or two angels, but there are two women, and it says that, let me read it again, verse 9, "Then lifted I up mine eyes, and looked, and behold, there came out two women, and the wind was in their wings," so they're moving swiftly, "for they had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up their ephah between the earth and the heaven. Then said I to the angel that talked with me, whither do these bear the ephah?" So you have these two women that have bird wings, large bird wings, and which, by the way, if you imagine what you see oftentimes depicted as what angels look like, as far as being these women with big bird wings, that's more similar to what's found in this passage of Scripture, which is not found anywhere else in the Scriptures, by the way. And so I do tend to believe these are not angels for that reason, specifically because you don't find that they're, I've heard people say, well, they're mentioned as women in other passages, and I've looked, and I've looked, and I've looked, and I've not seen it. So maybe you disagree with me, and that's fine. I just don't see it. Partly also because of what it's talking about. So anyways, they pick up this barrel. Like, all right, here comes judgment. Well, what's the judgment? Look at verse number 10. Where are they going to take this big barrel? Verse 11, I'm sorry. "And he said unto me, to build it in a house in the land of Shinar, and it shall be established and set there upon her own base." In other words, we're going to take it back to Shinar. Now, what's the big deal about that? Shinar, anybody else know what Shinar is known for? Anybody? I think somebody said it. Babylon. It's interesting that when Nebuchadnezzar built an image, he built it in the plains there in the land of Shinar, right? You have the Tower of Babel that is built in Shinar, Babel. So this is Babylon specifically. So wickedness is put in this place and then taken by these two women, and they're taken over to Shinar. And it explains that in verse number 6, this resemblance is all over the earth. And so wickedness is then brought there and consolidated into this place called Shinar, to Babylon. What's he talking about? He's talking about end judgment. What he's explaining here in this chapter so far, what you're seeing here is that there is a coming judgment according to his law that is going to be very extreme. Anytime you see it described this way, Ezekiel 2, Revelation 5, Revelation 6, Zechariah 5 here, this is one of great lamentation and mourning and woe. This is a really bad thing that's going to happen, and it's inescapable. Who is it for? It's for wickedness. Wickedness, people have come back from Babylon, and what this means is this is not for the Babylonians. He's describing that right here there's wickedness, and those that steal and those that swear, they're going to be put in this thing and taken far away over there. The idea is the sin. And so, anyways, what this is happening is describing, in my opinion here, but I believe it's largely understood scripturally, that this is the final form of apostate religion and government represented by the woman. Why do we see this? Well, a few reasons. One, in Revelation chapter 18, verse 7, it says, "How much she hath glorified herself and lived deliciously. So much torment and sorrow give her, for she saith in her heart, I sit a queen and I'm no widow." I'm actually one page ahead of my notes, so that's not what I meant. Page 4, page 3. All right. I don't have my iPad with me. My kids are home. I'm hoping they're watching this. But anyways, so what's going to happen here is that this is all leading to what's going to happen. What it's going to mention here in this passage when it comes to the ephah, typically representing grain and abundance and things like that. And so there is a financial element as far as reference there with it, but it's filled as far as what should be wealth and fatness and goodness. It's wickedness. And it's interesting that in Revelation chapter 18, when it describes this event that's going to take place, verse number 7 describes how they've lived deliciously, but yet much torment and sorrow give her. In verse 9, "The kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning." Verse 11, "And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise anymore, the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones." And so you can continue going on through the rest of the passage there. It describes the financial aspect and the bounty and the abundance, but it's all sourced specifically in Babylon. It's an incredible passage that's describing a lot of the end-time events that are there. Once again, very prophetic. But anyways, so it is pointing to the world of materialism and fatness and selfishness, materialistic wickedness as far as what's taking place there. But anyways, when you look at this, what you're finding here is it is represented by the woman. And it's interesting that in the book of Revelation, it's going to describe it. So this apostate form is represented by a woman again. It's interesting. In Revelation 17, it describes her as the mother of harlots. And so that there are many, but she's the mother of it. And so it's represented once again by a woman that is thrown into the barrel. And so anyways, I do believe that the two women that are represented there are unclean. I don't believe, again, that they're angels. It's not the biggest point. But it is sourcing, it is focusing everything on Babylon. That is a place where it's first attempt at a unified religion and a unified government. God is the one that said no. In essence, he said, no, not yet. We're not going to let you try that. People will continue to try that over and over again. Once again, people are trying to reduce everything of this world to unite us once again. Nebuchadnezzar, we addressed him about the image that he sets up in Dura in the land of Shinar. But anyways, this is in excess, the worldliness, the wickedness, the things that are being addressed here has to do with what's going to happen, and that God ultimately will judge. Now, a couple points of application. I'll be done very quickly. One has to do with the barrel itself. One is the fact that the barrel is representing them. What should be there, according to Haggai, has to do with the fact that they should be growing in their abundance. But if you remember that prophet, what happened when they worked really hard? What happened when they toiled and they spent their money and they planted seeds and they did all those things? What happened? They lost it all. It just kept happening. They put money in their pockets. Well, there was holes in the pockets. They would plant stuff, nothing would grow. And so that barrel, which is full of the wickedness, is not being filled up with what they're supposed to. And so ultimately, what's necessary then is that God will take care of that wickedness. He's saying there's wickedness, there's sin there. And what is being pointed out to Zechariah, I think, at that moment is this, that everybody that's come here, just because they're come here doesn't mean that they're all mine. And they're not willing to do what I want them to do. And they're not willing to be of mine. And they're demonstrating that they're still under the curse, is what he's explaining. And so it's very similar. It just goes in perfectly as far as the preaching of the gospel from chapter number 3 to chapter number 5, just the way it's all fitting in. It's beautiful. But anyways, with that, we have to understand something. Things may look good, but it doesn't mean that it is good. Ultimately, God will judge. Secondly, the point on this is that God will take care of wickedness. God will judge. Listen, it may seem sometimes we're losing. It seems like it's not getting where we want it to go, but ultimately God will judge. And the third part is this. What's in your barrel? What's in your barrel? If we understand that there's a resemblance of this all over the world, an idea here as far as application is that we have a barrel, and with our barrel, does it look like the rest of the wickedness of the rest of the world? In fact, we place things, and we're known for things, and oftentimes, while we're in the midst of all this, we are filling our own barrel, and it looks just like the wickedness of everybody else. What is this wickedness known for? Well, it's known for its stealing. It's known for swearing. On one aspect, I think there's an aspect of swearing that is not proper for Christians, primarily, and he's addressing the swearing when it comes to our identity with the Lord. It bothers me when we would use our Christianity as Christians to try to advance ourselves and get some kind of gain or profit from it. I don't think it's currently the case anywhere here, but I see that amongst quote-unquote Christianity. Well, they'll use that, they'll advance it, and the Bible describes that as swearing, and swearing falsely by his name. It's a false swearing. In other words, yeah, we're all about the Lord. Well, not really. We would use that. Further, we would steal, we would try to gain, we would try to get past what we are supposed to. We'd cross barriers we're not supposed to cross, and ultimately that's not representative of a Christian. So the question would be, what's in your barrel? In fact, when I went to Zechariah chapter 5, to be honest with you, I'm like, oh, easy passage. I preached a message on Zechariah 5 about 2015 or so, about what's in your barrel, and the whole point was just to blast Christians for what you're hiding in your barrel, and you're trying to hide it with lead and don't want anybody to see, but eventually it's going to pop out and God will show what's in there. The truth is the main emphasis is for the unbeliever, but for the believer, I would hope that your barrel is genuinely full with the grain and the fruit that God has provided as a Christian that's living in the Spirit. And so anyways, powerful passage, very deep, a lot of information. I would encourage you to study it out further. Again, if there's areas you're like, well, what about this or this? I'd be really glad to hear about those. Next Wednesday, we won't be in chapter 6 because we'll have the revival meeting, but then, God willing, the week following we'll be in chapter 6. So a lot of stuff, a lot of information. And so anyways, I hope that was a help to you. God will take care of it. God will judge. That could be very discouraging or it can be very encouraging according to His Word. So let's go ahead and pray and thank the Lord for this, and we'll have an offering, and then we'll have our prayer time. Lord, I thank you for the time you've given. We ask your blessing on what we've been given here in your scriptures. I pray it be a help to everybody, Lord, as it has helped me. Lord, we thank you again. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, let's go.